His name is Bradley Manning. He's a soldier in the US Army, and allegedly he gave a huge portfolio of America's state secrets to WikiLeaks. Now his court-martial is set to divide America.
So they want him to do a deal, they want him to turn the tables on Julian Assange.
I think that's completely correct. The US government is just trying to put immense pressure on him in order to get him to crack open.
Welcome to Four Corners. While the clock ticks down to WikiLeaks editor-in-chief Julian Assange's extradition to Sweden, the man who could hold the key to his eventual fate is locked in a military cell in America awaiting trial. Private Manning was stationed in Iraq when it's alleged he gave WikiLeaks 250,000 State Department cables and 500,000 US Army reports from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. It remains the biggest intelligence and diplomatic leak by far in global history. Manning has refused to implicate Julian Assange in anything he did. As a result, Manning may well spend the rest of his life in prison. This week marks the 40th anniversary of the Watergate break-in. The ensuing scandal led to the resignation of President Nixon, a man obsessed with leaks. The most famous whistleblower of that era, Daniel Ellsberg, is now Bradley Manning's most prominent supporter and features in our story tonight. We first reported on Manning's case nearly 18 months ago. Since then, a UN human rights rapporteur has condemned his treatment as akin to torture. Tonight, Quentin McDermott updates the story of Bradley Manning and his spectacular alleged exposure of America's secret world.
Hotel 26 is Crazy Horse 18. Have individuals with weapons.
4 radio. Rio Bands 14.
Yep, he's got a weapon too.
In April 2010, the most shocking vision to come out of the war in Iraq was published by WikiLeaks.
All right, firing.
Line here. What's the state line now?
Let me know when you get it.
One shoot.
Light them all up.
202 traffic, 260.
Come on, fire.
Hey, Roger.
Keep shooting.
The US Army video filmed in 2007 showed a group of men, almost all unarmed, being gunned down in a Baghdad street by an American Apache helicopter, and recorded the voices of the soldiers carrying out the attack.
God damn it, Kyle.
Come on, buddy.
I gotta do is pick up a weapon.
One man had reportedly been carrying an RPG, a rocket-propelled grenade, but 2 of the unarmed men who died were Reuters news staff, and 2 young children in a van were seriously wounded in the onslaught.
Clear. Clear. Coming around clear.
The title given to the video, Collateral Murder, marked the launch of a highly politicized agenda for WikiLeaks, driven by the website's founder, Julian Assange.
Of course, the title is absolutely correct. It speaks about a very specific incident. If you go to collateralmurder.com, you will see the exact incidents, talking about when a man is crawling in the street, completely unarmed, wounded, and he is killed by a 30mm cannon from the air, very intentionally, and his rescuers.
I watched the Apache helicopter attack in the video with the eyes of a former Marine infantry officer. I was a platoon leader and company commander, and I was also a battalion training officer who had trained troops on Nuremberg and the laws of war. It was very clear to me that what I was looking at was a war crime, was murder.
The video's credits paid tribute to our courageous source and advertised WikiLeaks' unbroken record in protecting confidential sources. But just 7 weeks later, Private Bradley Manning, an Army intelligence analyst based in Baghdad, was arrested and charged with leaking the video. It was a shattering blow, as a former spokesman for WikiLeaks, Daniel Domscheit-Berg, recalled when he spoke to Four Corners in Berlin.
When that happened, and when it was black on white that an alleged source of us was arrested, and it was in connection to this high-profile video, and it was by the US military, and he was detained in a prison in Kuwait, that was really devastating. And I can't even put words on how I felt. This was like falling into a pit that had no end.
Private Manning's arrest wasn't triggered by a lapse in security from WikiLeaks, a tip-off from a fellow soldier, or security checks in Iraq. Instead, and bizarrely, it was instigated by this man, a former hacker from California called Adrian Lamo. Mr. Lamo spoke to Four Corners on Skype. He says Bradley Manning approached him online after learning of their shared interest in WikiLeaks, and that their conversations ranged over several days. The words Private Manning is alleged to have used in their chats are voiced here by an actor.
I'm an Army intelligence analyst deployed to Eastern Baghdad, pending discharge for adjustment disorder.
Mr. Manning introduced himself factually as an intelligence analyst stationed at Forward Operating Base Hammer in Iraq. His initial communication was unremarkable. There was nothing that would lead a casual reader to believe that there was anything out of the ordinary about it. However, he soon began to drop hints about his access to classified information.
Hypothetical question. If you had free reign over classified networks for long periods of time, say 8 to 9 months, and you saw incredible things, awful things, things that belonged in the public domain and not on some server stored in a dark room in Washington, D.C., what would you do? Things that would have an impact on 6.7 billion people.
Adrian Lamo says Bradley Manning sensationally confessed that he'd passed vast amounts of classified material to WikiLeaks, including a war log from Iraq containing 400,000 events.
Let's just say someone I know intimately well has been penetrating U.S. classified networks, mining data like the ones described, sorting the data, compressing it, encrypting it, and uploading it to a crazy white-haired Aussie who can't seem to stay in one country very long. Crazy white-haired dude equals Julian Assange.
According to the records of these chats, Private Manning saw his own connection with WikiLeaks as significant.
I'm a source, not quite a volunteer. I mean, I'm a high-profile source, and I've developed a relationship with Assange.
Adrian Lamo says a moment came when he decided he had to act.
For me, the precise moment at which I felt that what Bradley Manning was doing was a danger to national security and to the lives of others was when he characterized one of his leaks as being in excess of 250,000 State Department documents.
Say 260,000 State Department cables from embassies and consulates all over the world, explaining how the first world exploits the third in detail from an internal perspective?
I knew for a fact, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that he could not possibly have vetted all of these documents himself for safety. It was simply being released in bulk to an unauthorized third party, a third party that had an unknown agenda. And this was the course of conduct that he was going to continue to engage in unless interdicted.
Adrian Lamo says he kept a record of the alleged confessions made by the 22-year-old soldier in Iraq. And when he tipped off military intelligence, it was like a scene from a spy thriller.
As any good crime movie will tell you, I met them at a diner. The meetings were ultimately multi-jurisdictional and at points involving individuals from the FBI, Army Counterintelligence, the Army Criminal Investigation Division, the National Security Agency, and other entities. I did not expect them to immediately arrest Mr. Manning, but they determined that that was the best course of action, and that is what happened.
So the magazine has actually been around since the early 1990s, before there even was a web.
In an equally sensational move, Adrian Lamo then offered his story and the alleged chat logs to Kevin Poulsen at Wired magazine in San Francisco. the two men met at this coffee shop near Sacramento.
I finally met up with Adrian in Sacramento at the Starbucks. He finally got his laptop working. He finally got the logs on his screen. And I was able to start skimming through what he had there. It kind of started to dawn on me, yeah, maybe this is real. Maybe he's actually turned in WikiLeaks' most important whistleblower.
Adrian Lamo says he gave the story to Kevin Poulsen as insurance in case something happened to him.
I discussed with Kevin my interaction with government agents up to that point. I provided him with a copy of the logs for safekeeping, and at that point I went on to meet with government agents. I myself did not know if I was necessarily going to be coming back from that meeting or if they would want to hold on to me for some unknown reason based on the information that I already had in my possession.
It was on the drive back from Sacramento where I found myself wondering if I was going to be stopped on the Bay Bridge by the feds saying, "Hey, you have something of ours." I mean, that I began to think that, yeah, this was actually a big story.
In the weeks following Private Bradley Manning's arrest, an even bigger story was building. Julian Assange by now was a wanted man, as he circled the globe with the treasure trove of documents he'd allegedly received from Private Manning. In conditions of great secrecy, Assange did a deal with two of the world's major newspapers, the New York Times and The Guardian.
There was a lot of cloak and dagger about it because he was, I think, probably the most hunted man on earth at that point because of what he had. And it sounded extraordinary. And when he first came back with his sort of password and we opened up the website, and this was just the first tranche, so this was just the first set of war logs, you could immediately see that this was, of tremendous significance and was going to make an awful lot of people and governments really unhappy.
What Assange had given The Guardian was the Afghan War Diary, a vast compilation of army reports from the war stretching back to 2004. More revelations would follow.
This disclosure is about the truth.
In October 2010, the Iraq war logs were published, detailing allegations of torture by the Iraqi Federal Police and complicity in that torture by the US Armed Forces in Iraq.
And this is a list of reports with sort of keywords in context.
The logs revealed the military's own inside story of the wars, and for the journalists charged with sifting through the documents, it was a God-given gift.
The greatest story, to my mind, of this era for journalists is the way, at least in the West, at least for the US, is the way September 11th has transformed American foreign policy. Not only in the ways that are very noticeable, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but in other ways too. And suddenly these as journalists who've had to rely on third-hand, fourth-hand, late-night interviews with people who knew pieces of this. We had the whole, so we were elated. Of course we were.
The publication of the Afghan and Iraqi war logs made Julian Assange a global celebrity. But while Assange was fated, Private Bradley Manning languished in a military cell. The soldier on his arrest had been charged with leaking more than 50 diplomatic cables to a person outside the army. But the authorities, who had Adrian Lamo's version of the chat logs, believed he'd passed on 260,000 cables.
There's been this US intelligence analyst, Bradley Manning, arrested, and it's alleged that he confessed in a chat room to have leaked this video to you, along with 280,000 classified US embassy cables. I mean, did he?
Well, we have denied receiving those cables. He has been charged about 5 days ago with obtaining 150,000 cables and releasing 50.
I mean, if you did receive thousands of US Embassy diplomatic cables...
We would have released them. Yeah.
You would?
Yeah.
So let's talk a little more...
In fact, the cables were already in Assange's possession, and 4 months later, they were published in The Guardian and New York Times. Just how seriously the US administration viewed this massive leak became clear when Dean Baquet and his colleagues approached the White House to discuss redacting the cables before they were published to ensure no lives were endangered.
We walked in with some cables just to show them what we had. And we walked in expecting, you know, maybe 2 or 3 people from the government, and it was a packed conference room. Of people from the Defense Intelligence Agency, the State Department, the White House. And it was a tense discussion. It was very tense. Initially, it was they were making the argument that these are not things that should be made public. There were people in the room who said this would have a devastating impact on foreign policy. And we made the argument back for why we felt obliged to publish.
Within WikiLeaks itself, there was also fierce debate about whether it was in Bradley Manning's best interests to publish the cables.
If the cables had not been published, there would have been no proof that anyone had given the material to a different entity. So from my perspective, whatever should have happened with these cables, for the sake of Bradley Manning, would have been to just keep them back as long as possible until you find out what is happening with him. Before you publish them.
We were concerned as to how that would possibly play into his case. We saw that his charges only included some 50 cables, so we're not sure whether that is related to the material that we've released, but we could see that extra accusations would probably be made against him, given that he was the only name being floated around by the US military.
After the cables were published, Private Manning was charged with 22 offences, including the charge of aiding the enemy, a capital offence. Military prosecutors say they will not seek the death penalty, but if convicted, the private faces life imprisonment.
Modus operandi is to...
Julian Assange insists the technology used by WikiLeaks prevents it knowing the identity of its sources.
So, I mean, I had never heard the name Bradley Manning before I saw media reports about this.
If Adrian Lamo's chat logs are genuine, Bradley Manning believed his contact at WikiLeaks was Assange. But according to Daniel Domscheit-Berg, it's quite plausible that Julian Assange didn't know the soldier's identity.
They could have talked without exchanging their names, or Bradley Manning wouldn't have necessarily told Julian his name.
Hillary Clinton and several thousand diplomats around the world are going to have a heart attack when they wake up one morning and find an entire repository of classified foreign policy is available in searchable format to the public.
The United States strongly condemns the illegal disclosure of classified information. It puts people's lives in danger, threatens our national security, and undermines our efforts to work with other countries to solve shared problems.
What has angered the United States government more than anything is the wholesale leaking of the State Department's diplomatic cables. Opinions differ as to how much damage this has done.
The government overall is horrified. This is the sort of the worst crisis in release of leaks of government documents, I think, in history. And for the State Department, it's really almost apocalyptic to have 250,000 cables lost. It affects our relations with every country in the world and puts sources of information, not only government sources, but human rights activists and dissidents and others at great risk.
I think the interesting thing is that nobody at the end of it can really point to any danger. I mean, everyone was saying the sky was going to fall in, that that people would be killed, that states would never be able to speak. But none of that happened. And now, in fact, the State Department is tacitly admitting that actually they can't point to any harm.
Ironically, this gigantic leak of diplomatic cables was only made possible by the US government's decision post 9/11 to bring in a policy of greater information sharing in the wake of the intelligence failures that allowed al-Qaeda's attacks to occur.
Major disaster is occurring in New York City this morning.
The new strategy meant that a lowly private stationed in Iraq was able to access enormous databases of secret and classified material. That policy was called net-centric diplomacy.
Net-centric diplomacy put the bulk of U.S. State Department cables on the military's private internet, its classified network called CIPRANet, where it could be accessed by hundreds of thousands of people in the U.S. and at foreign bases and posts. And that is what Manning apparently took advantage of.
Given this unparalleled access, Private Manning is believed to have breached security on the CIPRANet computer with almost farcical ease. Lady Gaga played a starring role, according to the chat logs, as Manning downloaded 250,000 diplomatic cables.
I would come in with music on a CDRW, labeled with something like Lady Gaga, erase the music, then write a compressed split file. No one suspected a thing. Listened and lip-synced to Lady Gaga's telephone, while exfiltrating possibly the largest data spillage in American history.
Private Manning's brief army career had been a troubled one. He'd been disciplined more than once and appears to have been suffering great emotional stress. But he says the turning point for him came when he watched a group of detainees he'd been told to investigate being taken by the Iraqi Federal Police, almost certainly to be tortured.
Everything started slipping after that. I saw things differently. I'd always questioned the way things worked and investigated to find the truth. But that was a point where I was a part of something. I was actively involved in something that I was completely against.
What we've heard from the people he unburdened himself to, Adrian Lamo, in the chat logs, was that his motives sound exactly like mine. He said, I was actively participating in something I was totally against. Why is the Obama administration so particularly sensitive about these releases?
Daniel Ellsberg is Bradley Manning's most prominent American supporter and America's most famous whistleblower. 40 years ago, he leaked the Pentagon Papers, revealing the duplicity with which successive American presidents had waged the war in Vietnam. But by leaking them, like Bradley Manning, Daniel Ellsberg risked being sent to jail for life.
In my case, it was when I finally came to see, late in the game, in 1969, when I looked at the origins of the war in the Pentagon Papers and realized that it had never been legitimate, that it had never been a legitimate basis for our killing Vietnamese, that I began to see all that killing as murder. And murder, it seemed to me, was something that had to be stopped, even if it put me in prison to do it. I would say that Bradley Manning has shown a willingness to give his life, his freedom, a life of freedom for his country, and you can't be more patriotic than that.
Daniel Domscheit-Berg fell out with Julian Assange and left WikiLeaks on acrimonious terms. He believes that taking on the US was always Julian Assange's priority.
I think he was aiming at taking up the biggest fight possible, and that fight was by taking up a fight against the United States, maybe in that case, as the biggest political player in the sphere. And that has some megalomaniac tendencies.
Is that your ultimate aim now, to radically change the behavior of the world's superpowers?
Yes, that's correct. We are all too well aware of the abuses by not just superpowers, but other powers, and by companies.
So are you a revolutionary?
Well, we'll see. If we end up with a decent revolution, then perhaps others can make that judgment.
Well, these are photos taken in late 2005.
Stephen Yates is a former advisor to Vice President Dick Cheney. He wants the United States to hit back hard against Private Manning and Julian Assange.
I consider it to be an act of political warfare. The acts appear to have been done by some U.S. citizens, including a member of the U.S. military who is subject to all the penalties attached to that office, but others have been foreign nationals. And when foreign nationals gather illegal, classified information and disclose it to try to influence U.S. policy, that is espionage.
The U.S. government's challenge in this case will be to show that what Mr. Assange was doing was not classic journalism and press, but in fact really theft of government property in a way that's not protected by the First Amendment.
To date, there is no clear evidence that Julian Assange helped Bradley Manning extract the files. Although military prosecutors say they have records of online chats between Manning and Assange in which Manning asked for help in cracking the main password on his classified Cypranet computer so that he could log on anonymously. Adrian Lamo says Bradley Manning did receive help, but he isn't saying from whom.
A third party with whom I had interaction subsequent to my interactions with Bradley Manning indicated that they gave Bradley Manning assistance in setting up encryption software, but that in and of itself is not a criminal act.
Who is that third party?
Well, they're a private citizen, and I would hesitate to draw undue attention onto them, because in this case, the good of the one does outweigh the good of the many.
Lots of people were coming and asking how they could upload material to us. You could tell them how to safely use a computer, maybe how to encrypt information. So that certainly was done. But I think that is pretty much valid. That's the same thing as a journalist would tell you, that you shouldn't write your sender's address on a brown envelope or something like this.
Adrian Lamo's word appears to have been accepted by the military investigators who arrested Private Manning. But within the hacker community he hails from, he's treated with far greater skepticism.
In the early 2000s, he hacked large corporations and a couple of media outlets, including the New York Times. And unlike most computer criminals, he was very public about it.
Adrian is a kind of guy that loves attention, and he loves to read about himself in newspaper articles and magazines, on online blogs, and it seems that he goes out of his way, even subjecting himself to federal prosecution by, he used to do this, break into computer systems and go to the press and tell them about it so they could write about it and it would be available on the internet.
Kevin Mitnick is himself a former computer felon. He's also a friend of Kevin Poulsen and Adrian Lamo.
I call into question the authenticity of those chat logs. Because I know this personality, then I call into question, well, if he is the sole person that had access to these chat logs, could have he modified them so he would have a great story to tell so he would get attention? I don't know. It's really hard to come up with the answer because I simply do not know.
But you think it's possible?
Oh, absolutely possible.
Did you modify the chat logs in any way?
Absolutely not. The chat logs were vouched for in a sworn deposition, which I gave under penalty of perjury. And every line remains as it was spoken.
Doubt has also been cast on Adrian Lamo's state of mind when he says he was chatting with Bradley Manning.
Mr. Lamo is a convicted felon who just 3 weeks before making these statements was in a psychiatric hospital. Wired magazine worked with that individual to bring out that story. I have no idea as to how credible that story is, but certainly it comes from a source which has no credibility at all.
Mr. Assange is certainly entitled to his opinions. I make no denials about the fact that I'm a convicted felon, or that I have spent time in a psychiatric institution for Asperger's syndrome, a syndrome which, I should add, does not affect the ability of its sufferers to recall facts. I should note that Mr. Assange is also a convicted computer criminal, so we have that in common. Perhaps one day we can get together over beer and discuss it.
For 11 months following his arrest, Bradley Manning remained in solitary confinement, first in Kuwait and then in a cell measuring 6 feet by 12 inside this US Marine Corps base outside Washington.
From meeting with Bradley, from getting to know him, and from watching his state degrade over time, the only conclusion I can reach is that this is torture.
David House is a computer researcher at MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He first met Bradley Manning at a hackerspace he'd founded in Boston, and for months was the only friend allowed to visit him at Quantico.
It was completely alarming. This transition had happened to him. He was ashen-faced, had huge bags under his eyes, and he had trouble keeping up with topics of conversation, something that had never been a problem for him. So it's this confinement, this solitary confinement, has really taken a huge toll on him, definitely.
At Quantico Marine Corps Base, Bradley Manning was held in conditions which his supporters argued were designed to break him and lead him to cooperate in building a case against Julian Assange.
If the allegations against Bradley Manning are true, he is the United States' foremost political prisoner. The increase in the severity of his treatment, according to my legal advice, is an attempt to pressure him into trying to embroil us in some sort of espionage-related charge.
I was held in solitary confinement back in 1988, 1989 by the federal government as a national security threat because a federal prosecutor had told a judge that I could whistle into a telephone and launch a nuclear weapon.
Kevin Mitnick is another former hacker who fell foul of the law. He is under no illusions as to why he was held in solitary confinement and what effect it had on his case.
What the government did is they stuck me in solitary confinement to, one, punish me, and two, get me to cooperate so they wouldn't have to really try the case. And it was extremely effective. And after 8.5 months of sitting in a room for 23 out of 24 hours a day, I just signed the deal.
So they want him to do a deal, they want him to turn the tables on Julian Assange.
I think that's completely correct. It's like a sledgehammer trying to crack a very small nut. The US government is just trying to put immense pressure on him in order to get him to crack open.
The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture, Juan Mendez, is one of those who has expressed concern about the conditions in which Private Manning was imprisoned at Quantico. As a young man, Juan Mendez worked as a lawyer in Argentina, defending political prisoners.
I complained of cases of torture, and eventually during the military dictatorship, I was arrested, tortured, and held in prison for 18 months without trial under administrative detention under the state of siege.
But of course, when Four Corners filmed this interview with Mr. Mendez last year, Private Manning had been held in solitary confinement for 230 days.
Solitary confinement is an area that concerns me. It's like a red flag, you know, and solitary confinement has been proven extensively in the scientific literature to create all kinds of very serious psychiatric consequences for the person subjected to it.
For a period during his imprisonment at Quantico, Private Manning was stripped of his clothing and forced to stand naked for morning inspections. In March this year, Juan Mendez said Private Manning had been subjected to cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment during his excessive and prolonged isolation at Quantico.
I want to stress the fact that the Torture Convention, the UN Convention Against Torture, to which the United States is a signatory and is a party, establishes that torture can be physical, but it can also be psychological.
The pressure applied by US intelligence agencies not just to Bradley Manning, but to supporters like David House has been intense.
I think the US government is trying to take down the WikiLeaks organization at all costs, and they are willing to embroil any individuals who get in their way, legitimate legal advocates or not, in order to do so.
2 years ago, federal agents came knocking on David House's front door.
At one point in this conversation, one of the gentlemen said flatly, while staring me directly in the eyes, if you can keep your ear to the ground on this thing, there might be a very large cash reward in it for you. It was very alarming to me. I mean, I didn't think the US government offered bribes to people.
But not all agents in this war of secrecy are working for the US government.
I don't like being in this particular city, being that's where all the federal people are who would love to know who I am. I'm actually kind of terrified right now.
When Four Corners visited Washington in January last year, this American hacktivist emerged from the shadows to meet us. He was working with AnonOps, the operational core of the worldwide group Anonymous.
If we have been identified and they decide to take action against us, they're going to attempt to silence this, and the story might not ever get out.
The story is how in December 2010, nearly 8,000 hackers launched a denial of service attack on some of America's biggest corporations, including Visa, MasterCard and PayPal, which were refusing to process donations to WikiLeaks. Operation Payback, as it was known, was organized by a small core group which included this man.
What motivates you? What drives you to do what you do?
I guess interest in freedom. I know it sounds kind of trite, but it is. It's a belief that all information should be free, regardless of where it comes from or regardless of who wants to see it. Nobody should be able to control who gets to see what.
Since our interview with this man was filmed, his fears have turned out to be justified. He's believed to have been arrested, along with other hacktivists in America and Europe. However, playing his part in this cyber war was a risk he was prepared to take.
It's definitely a risk. For some of us, it's the biggest risk we've ever taken in our lives. But those of us that have been in it this long, we believed in what needed to be done, and so we did it.
Hi, you've reached Brad Manning at my deployment phone number.
This is the only known recording of Bradley Manning's voice, taped when on deployment to Baghdad.
Please leave a message or call me back later. Thank you.
It's the voice of a man who, following his arrest, has now been silenced by the American military. Bradley Manning's fate is now extremely uncertain. He's been moved from solitary confinement at Quantico to another military base. He faces a full court-martial later this year, and if convicted, could spend the rest of his life in prison. So far, he has steadfastly refused to implicate Julian Assange, even though to do so could lead to a reduction in his sentence.
This guy's a traitor, a treasonist, and he has broken every law of the United States. The guy ought to be, and I'm not for the death penalty, so if I'm not for the death penalty, the only one to do it, illegally shoot the son of a Well, what about it?
On America's Fox TV, the right-wing commentators don't hold back in discussing Julian Assange's future.
Obama, if you're listening today, you should take this guy out, have the CIA take him out.
Even within the more politically considered circles of Washington, there's a strong commitment to nail Julian Assange.
We may need to detain Mr. Assange if he will not cease and desist from further disclosures. That's his choice. If he will not cease, then I think that we may have to consider extrajudicial measures in order to detain him and stop him from proceeding.
He would not be sent to Guantanamo. He would not be treated as a enemy combatant. If he were charged, he would be charged under federal criminal statutes, prosecuted in federal court, and if he were ultimately convicted, would be held in a federal penitentiary.
This Washington courthouse is where it's believed a grand jury has been sitting in secret preparing a sealed indictment against Julian Assange, which will allow his extradition to America and a trial for espionage.
The Prime Minister has the call.
Australia's government refuses to confirm this.
At this stage, we do not have any advice from the United States that there is an indictment against Mr Assange or that the United States has decided to seek his extradition.
But evidence that an indictment may have been issued comes ironically from confidential emails hacked into by members of Anonymous and published by WikiLeaks. The emails were written by staff at the Texas-based private intelligence firm Stratfor, who have close ties with the US administration.
I'm Fred Burton, Stratfor's Vice President of Intelligence. As you may know by now, an unauthorized party illegally obtained and disclosed personal information.
This email from Stratfor's Vice President Fred Burton says,
"Not for publication. We have a sealed indictment on Assange. Please protect."
Stratfor now claims this intelligence was unreliable. Sometime soon, almost certainly, Julian Assange will be extradited, not to America, but to Sweden, to be questioned there about allegations of sexual assault.
This may be my last time in public, so I thought I should start with a situation where you won't be able to see me anymore.
For Assange, any trial in America could be years away. But Private Manning's trial is imminent. The soldier's accusers say he betrayed his country and the oath of allegiance he swore when he joined the army. But in Europe, he's been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. To his supporters, Private Manning is a hero.
All the fame and all this hype about WikiLeaks and Julian's problems in Sweden. I mean, what are these problems in Sweden compared to the trouble that this private is in? I mean, this person who potentially is, I think, one of the biggest heroes for freedom of information in our time. So how does that relate? There's no relation in between these two things anymore. So that's what I don't get. Everyone should be talking about Manning and not about Julian's trouble in Sweden or in Great Britain or wherever.
God knows what happens now. Hopefully worldwide discussion, debates, and reforms. If not, then we're doomed as a species. I will officially give up on the society we have if nothing happens.
One thing is for sure. Julian Assange's fate is inextricably linked with Bradley Manning's. And the two men, whether they ever collaborated directly or not, share a common idealism.
I want people to see the truth, regardless of who they are. Because without information, you cannot make informed decisions as a public.
That truth provides a historical scaffold, a true scaffold on which a real state can be built, on which societies can be built.
If he could speak from his cell to the rest of the world, what would he say now?
Pay attention.
Bradley Manning's trial may not now start until November, but Julian Assange could be in Sweden before the month is out to face a totally different investigation, unless he decides to appeal his extradition to the European Court of Human Rights. That would be the last resort in his legal campaign to stay in Britain. Next week on Four Corners, the story of Australia's richest person, Gina Rinehart, and her ambitions to extend her wealth and her power. Until then, good night.